You know, it never ceases to amaze me how convinced I am in the initial day or two of acquiring a camera that I'm excited about, that I'm just convinced that it is the next step up in what I've been looking for in a camera body. But after spending a meaningful amount of time with it, realizing all the shortcomings and realities of said camera body. So this is my review of the new Canon R5 Mark II. I switched from shooting Nikon full-time to Canon full-time back when Canon released their first mirrorless camera, the EOS R. And I've been very happy with a lot of aspects of the Canon ecosystem. And I've extensively tried pretty much every camera body that they've released since. The R6, the original R5, the R6 Mark II, the R3, which is my go-to camera and has been for a while, and now more recently the R5 Mark II. So I'm extremely familiar with all of the quirks and ins and outs of pretty much everything that Canon offers, at least coming from a still photo perspective. Do not come to me asking about video. This entire review isn't even really going to mention video. But speaking of which, it's very odd to me that Canon replaced what used to be the power button switch with now a toggle between video and still photo. I'm guessing for a lot of R5 shooters that have used the body for years, it's going to feel a little weird to change that up and have to use the on-off switch near the mode button. I did write a really extensive article that includes about 17 RAW files ranging from low ISO to high ISO to different varieties of skin tones. That article is linked along with this video, so if you prefer to read a review, and honestly, I prefer to write reviews, not actually make videos. Operationally, there's not much new about this camera. It's very compact. I don't have another R5 to compare directly, but I have a feeling this might be a little bit lighter weight. This is a good time to also mention I am not a spec sheet reviewer, so if you want to look up exactly how much this weighs and compare it to another camera, go for it. But it feels to me that this is one of the smallest and lightest cameras Canon has made. In fact, one interesting quirk, that it's actually got a slimmer profile than the new battery grip that Canon released for it. You'll notice that it actually is wider. If you added both sides together, it's almost like a 1/4 inch or so wider than the actual camera body. It doesn't really change anything operationally. I just found that kind of odd. I will also note that at least compared to the R3 that I'm very used to, there's not quite enough of a dent here, especially with the grip attached, to quickly and easily flip open the view screen, which I am doing constantly. Obviously things like that just take getting used to. The strength of the screen and the overall build quality of this camera is absolutely fantastic. And I really, really love how it all feels in my hand, especially with the grip attached. I do still prefer slightly more the grip and feel of the R3 body, but that's also probably because I'm very used to this camera. I've made probably 1 million photos on the R3 body alone. So one thing camera changed in the R5 Mark II is that they added a new viewfinder feature called Autofocus, or something like that. I don't know the official name. It actually tracks where your eye is looking in the viewfinder and moves the focus point to where you're looking. I've used this feature extensively on the R3, and I gave it a couple solid hours trying it on the R5 Mark II. And I will say it does seem like the accuracy and performance on the R5 Mark II has improved compared to the original R3. That being said, I personally haven't found much of a use case for this. It's kind of nice, but even if it's extremely reliable, which I would say on this body it definitely is, my default state these days is to just shoot with the flip screen open anyway and kind of start at waist level. I only really bring my camera up to my eye level if I need to steady my camera because I'm using a slow shutter speed, or if it's really bright out and I'm having difficulty seeing the screen, or just randomly because I feel like it. But my go-to state is really just to shoot sort of at a 90-degree waist level perspective. I'm not sure if this is a first for all Canon bodies, but they did add these sort of secondary, when you're in play mode, secondary controls for buttons. So this little blue icon looks like an FTP server icon. When you're reviewing an image, you can hit this, and without having to customize anything, it'll just send your photos to an FTP server if you've connected that and you have Wi-Fi. There's also a crop option, and to be honest, I want to see more of this. I want every customizable button to also have a secondary feature when I'm reviewing images, or I don't know, maybe if I hold a button, I get a secondary function. The more I'm able to customize, the better. And Sony is just way ahead on this with all of their camera bodies. Canon still has some options that you can choose and customize for one button, and then on another button, the option's not there. I have no idea why that is. It must have something to do with how they've coded their menus or something like that. The grip overall is fine. I can definitely shoot about 5,000 images totally comfortably with 2 batteries, which the grip will contain easily. Canon has released yet another new battery. It's the same pin structure as their previous ones, but it's got a little bit more juice in it. One really smart move that Canon made was basically making it the same as the Canon R3 in that it has SD and CF Express card slots, which I'm very used to and I'm a huge fan of, especially since the SD is sort of my go-to memory card. I can pop that in a newer MacBook that actually has an SD card slot reader. The convenience is undeniable. And it's one of the reasons I'm a little worried to test the R1 when that comes out in another month or two. That only has CF Express, which is kind of annoying, and I'm not sure I'm willing to go back to no SD card at all. But CF Express, undeniably much, much faster, and you have to shoot to that card for certain features on this camera. So there are a couple of strange things about this camera body. I covered at least one major bug that I'm going to try and recreate here. And that's when shooting with flash, it oftentimes would show, if I hit image review, it would show the second to last photo that I took, not the most recent shot, which I've never seen happen on a camera before. It's very odd. I'm going to try and recreate it. And I hit review and it shows, again, the second to last image before the living room picture. Maybe this has something to do with write speeds, but I'm using extremely fast memory cards. But just from a technical level, it doesn't really make sense that it's a memory card speed issue. I don't know everything about their software pipeline, but what you're looking at when you actually review an image here is an embedded JPEG that's much smaller than the full size file. You're not looking at the original RAW file when you do that. So I'd be very surprised if it's simply a memory card issue. Another thing I found really odd, and we have to jump into Lightroom for this, I was doing some dynamic range tests to see just how much I could push and pull RAW files. And just as a side note, I got a lot of criticism with my Nikon Z8 review the last time because of how much I push and pull RAW files. And my preset and style of editing has really been a slow evolution over the last decade. And I'm using more or less the exact same approach that I've always used. And if a new camera acts notably different to me, I have a decade's worth of experience to know that it's nothing to do with my preset. It's something where the sensor itself is breaking down. But the issue that I found when doing these tests looks like this. So we've got this photo and this photo. And you can see a very extreme shift in white balance. But if we go over to the actual develop module, the exposure is shifted, but the white balance values are the same, which is really weird, seeing as how there is a clear shift in color temperature, and it will actually export like this as well. Maybe it's just an aspect of the sensor. Maybe it's something that Adobe messed up in their color profiles, because they've messed up creating profiles for Canon bodies before, where they literally had to create a version 2 camera profile. That was a real mess with the EOS R years ago. This is likely an Adobe issue, not a Canon issue, but I don't know if it's only affecting this body because I don't have this problem with my R3 files at all. When switching back and forth between them, there is a clear shift in white balance color, and I don't know why. So hopefully that's a bug between Adobe and Canon that can be resolved with minimal issue. Who knows? Looking at actual photos, made at real life wedding days, I want to dive into a couple of the files here and just sort of edit our way through them. All of these are using my gain stage preset, but I'll also reset some of these to be just like the original out of camera files. So if you like something that isn't my regular preset look, that's what they look like. The auto white balance in general, I think, is really fine, but I do notice for sure a difference in how color is rendered. And it's always surprising to me when the same camera manufacturer has a difference in color rendering from one camera to the next. Again, some of this is an Adobe issue. They may not have accurately matched one camera sensor to the next in their camera calibration profiles, but whether that's an Adobe thing or a Canon thing, just be aware of it. You're gonna definitely have different colors, and you're probably gonna have to create a custom tweaked version of your editing to match from one camera body to the next. Overall, the dynamic range of these files is really, really good, especially at base ISO. You can really, really push these files to have a lot of dynamic range. This is one of my favorite lenses that I shot through. It's the old EF mount 50 1.0. So this is a lens that Canon discontinued because on a DSLR, the autofocus was just almost always a miss. But in the world of mirrorless, even through an adapter, the autofocus on this lens is amazing. And the lens, when shot directly into a harsh light source, creates this really cool rainbow flare just naturally in itself. Looking at some of the high ISO values, so this is 32,000 ISO. I'll zoom in here. I mean, these are 45, I believe, megapixel files. So these are huge files. I probably wouldn't even deliver that full res file to my client, but you can certainly crop a lot. And at that resolution, I would say this ISO performance is really, really good. There's no noise reduction being applied right now, and it's just my baseline starting preset. It does greatly pull back highlights and boost shadows, but you can see even when this is reset, there's a fair amount of noise, but at 32,000 ISO with a sensor this big, it's not that problematic. Here's some extremely high ISO tests. So if we go up to 102,000, which I didn't even bother with, it's insane. I mean, it's just really unusable. Even if you run it through Lightroom's new denoise reduction, it's just not really going to be recoverable. You could probably go black and white with it and be fine, but also be aware, especially with file sizes this big, even if something looks kind of okay in Lightroom, when you go to export the full res version, it'll often look worse in the final export than in the Lightroom display window. That's just because whether you're in develop mode or library mode, one or the other, you're almost always looking at a preview of the file itself, not the full high-res raw file, especially if you render smart previews. So you'll notice that, yeah, it looks kind of okay here. Maybe I can export it without any noise reduction, and then when you export it, it looks absolutely terrible unless you print much, much smaller. I've also noticed a significant amount of moire. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. Moire? It's basically just an array of patterns due to, again, the high resolution of this sensor. So on a lot of screens, it may not pick it up in my screen recording on my laptop here, but a lot of screens, you'll notice at high ISO, when you open the image, it has like this weird banding kind of effect. Shooting with the R3, the sensor is significantly smaller. It's almost like half the size, and I don't notice nearly as much moire as I do on the 45 megapixel R5 Mark II. I quickly want to go through some of just my favorite images made from this camera, and this is a perfectly capable camera. Don't get me wrong. I'm gonna send it back. I'm not gonna keep shooting with it because, especially for my use case, being a wedding photographer, it's too high resolution and it's kind of just a little too buggy and clunky for me. I'm sure some of these bugs will be worked out between Adobe and Canon, and maybe the flash thing will be worked out with a firmware update, but in its current state right now, it's just not a camera that I think is well optimized for still photos on a wedding day. It can perform wonderfully, and one of my favorite tests is, again, throw on this 51.0 lens and see how well it does tracking autofocus. And it did extremely well. The autofocus with this camera is on par, if not better, than the Canon R3, which I would hope they've made some improvements in the mechanics of how autofocus works over the years. But tonally, the color and the tones of these files are by far what are my favorite things about this camera, especially at base ISO. It just really has a beautiful look. In all the color channels, that's the case, but particularly with reds and kind of anything in the warmer yellow range and greens. They just really, really sing in a way that I don't really feel when I edit my Canon R3 files. So it's a shame that I'm not going to recommend this for wedding photographers. Maybe for hybrid shooters with video. Again, I don't know much about video. I don't care about video. All the video I do is just for talking head stuff with Patreon and YouTube. But in a lot of the decisions Canon is making recently, especially around their lens design, it seems like they are really starting to lean more toward video as what they want to optimize for, and really kind of just make improvements for. It's like people that shoot primarily video and still photos as the secondary thing. That is not the case with the R3. It is still primarily a still photo camera, which I really appreciate. So yeah, looking at these photos, this is a very capable camera. This is 16,000 ISO. You'll notice when I get in here, it's a little noisy, but totally manageable, especially for, you know, the average normal person's print size or website and social media posts. But here's a great example of the red just really, really being rich in a way that I haven't seen basically since I think the EOS R sensor, which was a previous favorite of mine. Going back to dynamic range for a second. Overall, I think this sensor does perform pretty well. I'm just gonna pick a random picture here. But I would expect maybe a little bit more dynamic range. I don't know what the spec sheet says. It seems like it's still not quite as good as what my old favorite, the Nikon D850 sensor could even manage. And that sensor was a similarly sized 45 megapixel SLR camera sensor. Same size, but I'm pretty sure I was able to get more dynamic range, especially in the highlights, out of my D850 than I'm currently able to get out of the R5. Now, compared to the R3, way more dynamic range. It definitely seems like the files respond with a lot more flexibility. But in other words, it's still not completely blowing my mind in a way that I was hoping it would. Let's just pick out a few more random photos to just kind of edit and get a feel for the files. These are not culled, and they just have my import preset applied. So I'm just randomly picking some images to sort of play around with and give you a sense for how they react. But again, my actual review article over on Patreon is probably where you want to dive in for a little bit more in-depth actually looking at the photos and kind of reading my thoughts about it. Let's go to this night shot of the venue. This is at 51,000 ISO, so pretty extreme. I would definitely recommend running this through some noise reduction. I'm not going to right now because I actually want you to see what these files look like at close to a starting point. Just exporting 52,000, so you can really see with the high-res export the issues with noise that pop up in the darkest areas here. That detail is really just totally gone. The highest ISO I would say that I'm comfortable shooting with this camera is probably around 12,800 to 16,000. If it's really well exposed, and if not overexposed, at 20,000 ISO, I think you can get away with some pretty clean files. 16,000 is about as much as I'm willing to push the sensor, and you can already see it's almost like it's desaturated in a way that I do not notice at lower ISO. Let me see what this photo looks like fully exported. Yeah, again, even at 16,000 ISO, this noise is pretty messy. And that's not a huge shocker coming from a sensor this size. And if you do export at a lower resolution, it's not nearly as notable an issue. But the final thing I want to talk through is something I also got a lot of crap about with my Nikon Z8 review, and that's the sound of the shutter. Hopefully that's coming through in the mic okay. The shutter sound really matters to me. On average, I take about 6,000 to 7,000 images across an entire full wedding day, and easily 1,000 photos at just like an hour-long engagement session. So the sound of the shutter really adds up and really matters to me. It's crazy to me that people are, one, happy shooting all the time in silent mode, which this will do, and silent shooting is exactly that. It's 100% silent. But I personally get a lot out of the mechanical feel and responsiveness of the shutter clicking, and I'm very sensitive to whether or not I like the sound or not. There were Sony bodies from 5 or 6 years ago that had the most terrible shutter sound imaginable. It was like two pieces of plastic getting smacked together. And no matter how good the camera was, I just couldn't bring myself to shoot with it across an entire long wedding day. So I just want to also play the sound of the R3. It's got a much faster, much snappier sound to it. And again, comparing that now to the R5 Mark II, it's definitely a more muted and pillowy, kind of chunkier shutter. Again, this is totally my personal preference. I greatly prefer the sound and feel of the R3 shutter. So that's it. Those are my thoughts. I'm sadly sending this back today. It's been a good run, but I'm much more interested and excited to try out the R1, again, for my specific use cases. If you have any comments or thoughts, definitely let me know. I'm sure many of you will. As always, thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be back soon. Bye, everyone.